I grew up in a small town that had more cornfields than people. It was in the middle of the Midwest, a place with one stoplight and only one decent restaurant that probably sells barbecue or cell phones now. It was a tiny place, but if you've eaten an ear of corn in the last 20 years, then it was probably grown somewhere in that area. My family was no exception. Every spring, when the snow finally melted, my dad and I would go out and do the first farming of the season, the rock farming. The only thing that seemed to grow quicker in that area than the corn was the rocks. I asked Dad when I was very young how we had so many rocks that kept coming back every year, and he would just shrug. We would get all the rocks out of the field. Once or twice, we even stacked them up to make a fence, but it always fell down when the rain came. And then we would start planting our 80 or 90 acres for the season. It was a lot of work, but we always did the planting ourselves. There would be plenty of time during the harvest to hire people to help us, but Dad always liked to keep as much of our money in the family as he could. Mom and I would be out in the field right along with whatever farm hands Dad had managed to lay hands on that year, and by the time the last of the corn was harvested, there was always money in my savings account. Some of it was for me, but most of it was for college. Dad was always very strict on the idea that if I wanted to do more than pull rocks out of the ground and grow corn, then I needed an education. He let me go to school as often as I could, but it was just he and Mom and I, so I ended up missing some during the planting and the harvest time. What I remember most about those times were the strawmen that we set up in the fields. That and the weird noises that they made. Dad and I would make about 20 scarecrows every year and set them in the field. We usually got the clothes from the ones that were too small for me, or from the rag bag at the church that even the homeless people would turn their noses up at. It was a regular southern social out there, most years. Scarecrows in tube tops and little shorts, fellow scarecrows in chambray shirts, scarecrows in old jackets and sweatpants, and anything else we could lay hands on. We always donated clothes back at the end of the year, but I think the church mostly just threw them away after that. Aside from the clothes, every scarecrow got a wooga horn. Wooga horns were what Dad called them. I don't know what they actually were called, but he would take old cans and stretch a piece of resin string across the mouth. Then he would hang them off the hands of the scarecrows and dangle them from hats, like the earrings of fancy ladies, and when the wind blew through them, it would make a strange sound. It was like a wailing, and it sounded damn spooky no matter what time of day. I've been out in the field on a windy day, the sun shining overhead, and felt a shiver run down my spine as one of those lonesome cries comes creeping up out of the cornfield. The story I'm going to tell you about is one that happened when I was in high school. It was the year right before I went to college, and it was ultimately the reason I returned to the Midwest when I was done. After what I experienced that picking season, I feel I have a duty to the place. You see, it all started when Dad caught the crud. Dad was a big guy, no shrinking violet, and I don't think I'd ever seen him sick more than a half a dozen times in my life. Any other time I've seen him sick, he had always just muscled through it. He would drink his juice, probably dosed with some corn whiskey from under the sink, and he would hack into his handkerchief as he worked in the field, and he would just get over it. He never belittled me for staying in bed when I was sick, but he was never one to take time off because he was feeling punky. The crud, which was what he called it, was something a little different, though. Dad woke up one morning at the end of October and was doing a lot of coughing into his handkerchief as he ate his breakfast. Mom had asked him if he wanted something for it, but he shook it off and said it was probably just his allergies. He would work a day in the field and hack it out of his system and be right as rain in a couple of days. Well, a couple of days came and went, and Dad was far from right as rain. I had to come home in the middle of the day to help him in the field, something I did quite often in those days since my studies were all done. And when I heard a strange noise from the road beside me, I looked up and saw that he had fallen over amidst the corn. When I tried to help him up, I could tell that he was feverish. The fever was baking off of him, and he was nearly delirious with it. I helped him inside, told Mom to call the doctor, and when the doctor got there, Dad came around enough to answer his questions. He still claimed he was fine, wanted to get out of bed and get back to work, but the doctor told him that if he did that, he'd be dead inside of a week. He was running a fever that was about 102, and he was also dehydrated. I recommend bed rest, lots of fluids and juices, and medicine that doesn't come out of a ceramic jug, said the doctor. He said the last, looking pointedly at my dad, clearly guessing where most of his medicinal notions came from. I remember bringing food to my dad and asking how he felt while he stayed in bed. He always said the same thing. He said it was nothing but a little cold and that he would get over it soon and he'd be back in the field before the harvest was due. Well, that time never seemed to come, and Dad was still in bed when Mom started making preparations for Thanksgiving. I think now, looking back on it, that he must have had pneumonia or something, because he was prone to being sick in the late part of the fall for the rest of his life. It always seemed to come back around Halloween, and Dad would often hire people to bring in the final harvest, so that he could rest and be ready when the cold weather came. So, I was the one that had to organize the final harvest that year. There was still fields to be tended, if we wanted that last batch of corn, and I found myself in the field after dark plenty of times that year. I don't think I had ever heard the noise before, but I think I remembered subconsciously that I had somehow. I have these foggy memories from childhood times when I couldn't have been more than about 5 or 6, waking up in the night and hearing the wooga horns in the field and thinking that they had to be moving. The lonely sound they made would move from right to left across the field, and sometimes they would go back as I lay there in bed and shivered. There were also times when my dad would ask me if I had moved some of the scarecrows, but I always told him that I hadn't. The scarecrows weren't toys, he had always made that clear enough, and once we set them, they weren't to be moved until the first snows came, and it was time to put them away again. The first week he was in bed found me in the field after dark, as I tried my best not to disappoint him. I was tending just one row left, really trying to get as much out of it as I could, and thankfully I had the moon overhead to help me. It was full and round, and the light it sent down was better than any porch light. The wind wasn't too fierce that night, but I could still hear the wooga horns on the scarecrows from farther back in the field. I knew that dinner would be ready soon enough, and I was surprised that Mama hadn't called me already. As I prepared to head inside, I heard that lonesome cry a little closer this time. It made me shiver as I decided to pack it in and get washed up for dinner. As I moved through the field, I could feel something watching me. The moon would cast its shadow down on the corn rows, and in that light, I could see something as it scampered between the rows. It was too fast for me to see, too slick to be caught by some half-grown man, but I could still hear that spine-chilling noise it made as it made its way over my senses. At first, it was just one, then 2, then 4 or 5. They would stop and start, sometimes sounding miles away the next time I heard them, and my feet itched to run. I made myself walk, however. You didn't run from predators, I knew that, and when I got to the back porch, it took all my senses not to turn around and look behind me. I didn't sleep well that night, and it wouldn't be the first time. When the men came back to help us harvest, I was yawning and stretching as I took my coffee out onto the porch. "Where's the boss today?" said one of them, and I grimaced as I recognized the voice. His name was Michaels, and I didn't much care for him. He hadn't done anything to warrant it, but I had a feeling. Have you ever seen somebody look at you and just knew they were up to no good? Well, that was this fellow. He looked like a rat, and he smelled twice as bad. Most of the hands Dad had hired stayed at this little motel about a mile from the farm, a place that gave discounts to hands we hired, but I suspected that Michaels was sleeping rough in the woods beyond our east field. He came to work dirty, in the same clothes he was wearing the day before, and stinking of sweat. He didn't seem to mind, and he picked corn like a madman, so neither did we. Still, when you were out in the field with him, especially when no one else was around, it was like being inside a sick person's head, all that dull heat and red madness swirling around him like a miasma. At the time, I thought my apprehension around him was nothing but exhaustion. Those woogahorns had been keeping me up nights, and I was ready to drop and irritable as a stepped-on cat. I was prone to being short in those days, and a lot of the hands mumbled about how the son was certainly not the father as they picked. Not Michael's, though. He just kept right on smiling his rotten-toothed smile whenever I was short with him and accepted my money at the end of every day. Then, every night, I lay in bed and listened to the woogahorns as they moved through the fields. I laid awake for nights, wondering how they did it. Surely the scarecrows weren't moving, but what other reason could there be? It didn't make any sense. Strawmen did not, as a rule, move on their own. That was a fact. I told myself this again and again as I lay in my narrow single bed, repeated it to myself again and again, but the more I said it, the less secure it made me feel. It was Friday, the last day of picking before we packed in for the year, and the clock on the nightstand said it was 2 a.m. The wind had been light but steady all night, and the sound of the woogahorns had been just as steady. Sometimes I couldn't tell if I was asleep or awake. Those woogahorns were in my dreams as often as they were out of them. They moved in the fields, sometimes right outside my window, trailing a ghastly woo-woo behind them like a crooked tail. I had actually come out onto the porch to make sure I wasn't dreaming, wanting to see the cornfield so I could prove it to myself. I never dreamed of the corn. My dreams were always very lively, and I thought that just seeing all that corn might convince me that it was real, if it was. So there I stood on the front porch, my chest prickling in goose flesh in the end of November cold, and squinted at the field. No full moon tonight. The moon was little more than a ghostly sickle as it hung over the field. The wind rustled the corn, what corn was left, and the empty stalks made a sound like bones in a holler. The next week they would all be yanked up and ground down, fertilizer for next year's crops, and the field would be as barren as my face after a good shave. Today, however, the stalks made for a ghostly clatter as they jittered and danced in the wind. I heard no lonesome wail now, no querulous call from the open throat made of string, and the longer I stood there, the sillier I felt. Clearly, I had been mistaken. I had been hearing things, jumping at shadows, and now I could return to my bed with the knowledge and the sound of that first lonely note as it rose above the fields made my skin break out in skitters that had nothing to do with the chill. In the thin light of that sickle moon, I could see shapes amongst the corn. They were human-shaped. They moved as humans do. But something about that movement wasn't quite right. It was the way a man might move if he had no bones, no spine, nothing to hold him together but skin and the loosest kind of tendons. They moved like loose corn husks in a breeze, and those horns came behind them, sounding their eerie midnight orchestra. There were 4, then 8, then as many as 20, and as they came before to the front of the house, they all turned their ghostly faces towards me. Their oil-slick eyes looked at me from behind sackcloth faces. They were hunkered down, ready to fly at me at a moment's notice. I was 5 long steps from the door, but it felt like a mile. I didn't like this. Why had I come out here? Why was I such a fool to need proof? The longer I stood here, questioning whether or not this was a dream, the more sure I was that I had to be dreaming, and the less sure I was that this could be real. They were staring at me, staring through me, and I bolted for the door like a scared rabbit. I was through it and had it closed tight before they could get me, but the expected bang of the strawmen against the door never came. I stood with my back against it, shivering hard enough to rattle the glass, but the longer it went on, the more I began to doubt what I believed I had seen. I leaned around slowly, coming up on my toes as I peeked through the glass at the top of the door, but all that awaited me at the other side was the murky wavering of corn in the field. I stood there for a long time, just looking, watching, waiting, but none of them showed their face again. I went to bed, but the call from the Woogahorns was loud and mournful, and my sleep was thin and restless. I thought for the dozenth time about talking to Dad about the sound, but as he loosed a loud, wet cough from the guest room, a room that had become his sick room, I put the thought aside. I wouldn't bother him with such things that were likely just in my own head. I drifted off in the wee hours, the sun already a promise on the horizon. The next day, we worked like madmen to get the last of the corn boxed up and ready for market. Michaels was there again, packing boxes with the rest, but I couldn't help notice the way he watched my mother and I as we worked. My father had been bedridden for nearly a month, and maybe he had started to think that he had run off on us, and we were simply trying to get by. I don't know what exactly he was thinking, and I'm glad I never found out. At the end of the day, all the corn was packed neatly in the barn for the last of the trucks to get tomorrow, and I handed out the day's wages and bid them all farewell till next year. The others left, talking about going to the bar or heading to the barn dance later that evening, but Michaels lingered for some reason. "Yeah?" I asked him. "Was there something you needed?" "I was just wondering if I might take a meal with you and your mother tonight," he said, smiling rottenly through his brown teeth. "I've got a long journey back tomorrow, and a hot meal might send me on my way quicker." Sorry, we haven't enough extra for a fourth. If it's a hot meal you're after, you might try Katie's on your way out of town." "No room for a fourth," he repeated, smiling like he knew better. "If you say so." He left, but I felt sure that he hadn't gone far. As I went about the task of shuttering the barn and securing the farm, I felt eyes on me. These were not the black eyes of the strawmen that I had seen the night before either. These eyes didn't come with the lonely call of the Woogahorns, but felt more like the eyes of some predator who was sizing up a meal. I put my hand on my knife in my pocket more than once, hoping I wouldn't need it, and when Mom called me in for supper, I locked the doors before going to wash up. I didn't tell her what I suspected as she went to take Dad his dinner. There was no sense worrying her needlessly, and she had more than enough on her plate without my tired megrims. After dinner, I tried to stay awake a little, but ended up falling asleep on the couch instead. I was exhausted, too tired to worry about strange eyes or strange sounds, and when I came awake suddenly in the middle of the night, I felt a blanket thrown over me slip to the floor. I wondered what had woken me up at first, thinking I might just head to bed while I was feeling sleepy, and that's when I heard it again. It was a loud, tortured scream from the field, and I was up and moving before I was fully awake. I came out onto the front porch, the shotgun we kept by the door already in my hand, and I was working the slide as I tried to gain control of my galloping heart. The wind was up again, those Woogahorns practically screaming amidst the bare stalks, but it didn't drown out the piercing shriek of whoever was being murdered in my family's field. From the porch, I could see those familiar boneless shapes as they scuttled across the field. But tonight, they didn't seem to have any time for me. They were moving away from the house, towards the east field, and as they crashed amongst the empty stalks, I heard the same scream yet again. I hesitated on the porch, still not sure I wanted to go crashing off into the corn, but finally I found my courage as I headed into the night. If they were killing someone out there, then I needed to put a stop to it. I went running through the corn, the skeletal stalks slapping at me as I went, and as I came through the farthest row beside the fence, I saw it. They were huddled around it, their faces turning as they regarded it, and when I shouted at them to clear off, they flew like straw in a high wind. It was Michael's, all curled up in the fetal position, and he was dead. I had to get pretty close to be sure, but his chest wasn't moving, and he was lying much too still to be alive. I touched his neck, careful not to touch anything else, and when I didn't feel a pulse, I left him there in the field so I could call the sheriff. He came with an ambulance from the home central, and the guys in the truck said it looked like he'd had a heart attack. His face was set in a rictus of fear, and he had clutched his legs so hard that he had left bruises on them. The sheriff thought I had done something to him at first, but when I explained that I had just found him screaming in the field like that, I think he started to think otherwise. He told me he'd look into it, and a couple of days later he came out to the farm and apologized for suspecting me. "Turns out," he said, taking a seat and inviting me to sit as well, given that my father was still bedridden, "that man your father hired was named Charles Tilley. Charles, or someone who fits his description, is wanted for questioning in a string of home invasions, many of which turned violent. Far as I can figure, he signs on to work at farms and orchards for a season, doing picking and packing and such, and then, after everyone else has left, he robs them, and sometimes he does a little worse than that. The last one was a recent widow and a young son, and after he robbed them, he took a little more from them than their lives. Both of them," he emphasized, giving me a square look. I let that sink in as we sat in the rockers, listening to the wind blow the dirt off the recently tilled down field. "You and your mama are very lucky, boy. Probably your daddy, too. He likely intended to do for all three of you and take whatever you had in the house before he had his little heart attack." He took his leave then, saying if I needed him, all I had to do was call. After that, the sound of the wooga horns put me at ease. It was still a little spooky to hear from the fields, but it let me know that the scarecrows were looking out for me and Mom. Dad, once he got better, laughed when he saw the scarecrows in the field well into December and asked if I liked them that much. I told him I did, and from then on, the scarecrows never went back in the barn unless the wind was very bad. I live in the town now, working as an accountant, but I still help Dad in the fields when he needs me. I still listen for the lonesome cry of the wooga horn, too, listening out for the straw guardians that saved me from a very bad man one night in November. You're still here. Thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague here. Always a pleasure to see all my new and old viewers coming by for another one of my spooky tales. If you'd like to support the show, you can always take part in one of our channel offers through Fume or Aura, or you can just click on another video when they come up. I'd really appreciate it. For our newer viewers, we also have lots of playlists and other things if you'd like to get caught up. I know some of my series have been going on for quite a while. If you'd like to get my latest book, there's a link down below that'll take you to my Amazon page. Towesey Homestead just came out, so if that's something you'd like to get your hands on, go ahead and have a look down there. If you'd like a signed copy, you can go ahead and email me from my email address on the site, and I'll get with you about shipping information and ship you a signed copy. If you'd like to support the channel in a more monetary fashion, we also have membership through YouTube, and we've got a Patreon that you can get the information for in the description. We have lots of tiers and everything to suit your needs. Patrons that support on the $10 tier, that's our Ghostly Reader tier, get a book anytime I write one, signed and on their doorstep. As you may have noticed, there's a list of patrons and members on the screen, and I'd like to personally thank every one of them for taking a hand in the future of this channel. Well, that's enough for tonight. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.